on there.
Okay, I want to bring in Charles Ramsey, former local police chief, on this latest news that we have coming in that the shooting suspect has been apprehending. But Charles, that does not mean the work is done. Law enforcement has to determine whether this is the only person in that building that was part of the shooting, correct?
Yeah, they're going to continue to search that entire facility just to make sure. I would assume you have some people that have sheltered in place. They obviously have to get to them. You may have wounded that have not yet been detected, and you've got a crime scene. Yeah, their work is just starting, actually. It's good that they've got an individual in custody, but again, they can't take a chance on this being the only person involved. They're going to make sure that everything is thoroughly searched. They've located all people who are in there, again, tend to any wounded that are in there, and maintain the scene itself.
Okay, and we are told that the hospital there, Mercy Medical Center and Rush Copley Medical Center, they've been receiving patients who were injured in the shooting at this valve company in Aurora, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. I want to bring in retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent James Gagliano. James, we heard from a witness speaking to one of our affiliates who essentially said that he recognized the shooter, that this was one of his colleagues, someone that he recognized, and that the shooter was carrying a pistol. Of course, this person also said, look, the shots were breaking out. I got a quick glance and I had to run. But what do you make of what we're learning from this one witness that has yet to be corroborated, we should note?
Well, firstly, Pam, outstanding news that the shooter has been apprehended. Now, that doesn't mean the job is over. The first thing is, were there any accomplices? Is anybody else involved in this? And law enforcement has to treat this as a conspiracy and not as a, hey, we've got the guy in custody, we're good to go. The difficult part in this assessment, I think Chief Ramsey could agree with me on this, the difficult part in tactical resolution is making the calculus on the scene in real time. Is this a hate crime? Is this somebody who has a dispute at work, a workplace violence issue? Is this a domestic incident? And then once the law enforcement officers arrive on scene, there are three things that you quickly have to cycle through. Is this an active shooter that we need to move to and bring down, interdict as quickly as possible? Or is this a barricaded subject where we can put up a perimeter and contain and negotiate? Or is this a barricaded subject with hostages? So those are the three things that law enforcement is trying to cycle through in the immediacy of these instances. So most importantly, make sure that there's nobody else that is working with the shooter that they have apprehended right now, and then dealing with the people that were witnesses, finding out as much information as you can. In the FBI, we tell people in these type of situations, run, hide, fight, and tell in that order. So go to law enforcement and immediately share whatever information you have as far as the description of the subject, where other people may be, and where any other wounded people might be at the time.
And again, even though that shooter was apprehended, like you said, this could still be an active situation. They haven't ruled out that there are more shooters. But Josh Campbell, you were in the FBI not long ago. I remember in covering the FBI, they did compile a mass shooting data paperwork about how common these shootings are, if it's more than one person. And typically, if I'm not mistaken, Josh, in situations like this, most of the time in mass shootings, it is one individual, though they have to act as though there could be more, correct?
Yeah, that's all right, Pam. It's usually one, but they're not going to, hang their hat on that. This is part of an investigation now that they're going to have to determine both if they're able to interview that subject, if this person is cooperative and then able to, to speak with officers. They're going to want to glean that information. They're going to now dig into his life, his social media, his associates. We could expect to see, possibly search warrants executed at his residence. Again, try to learn as much as they can about this one person in order to determine whether this person actually acted alone. And one thing that's also interesting from that study that you mentioned, and this goes to what is very important for us as we cover these incidents, is that once an affiliate from news station shows up there on scene, with this helicopter footage, it's often after the incident already happened, after it already already took place. These things are often over in a matter of minutes. And so we continue to try to assess and, analyze what we see based on some of this footage, but we can't mistake this police presence from what is actually going on inside. As we mentioned earlier, just the sheer magnitude of this facility is going to require a lot of officers, again, to go through, to investigate, and then to talk to all the witnesses we spoke about. This is what we're seeing on our television. What we're not seeing is what's going on behind the scenes, and that is really digging into this subject's life now in order to find a motive for what transpired here.
So just to hit on what you just said, you said normally these things are over in a matter of minutes, but this went on, if I'm not mistaken, for around an hour. What do you make of that, Josh?
Yeah, so there's a lot of unanswered questions here. We don't know if officers were actually in communication, if they had, identified and located the shooter. Again, it's a massive facility, so we don't know if this person was fleeing and attempting to, find cover, or attempting to, flee and exit the building altogether. We just don't know what his initial contact was with law enforcement officers, whether they engaged him and then he surrendered. Sometimes in these situations, we see the person want to go down, and they don't make it out. In this case, with the word they're using, apprehended, that suggests at least that he's been taken alive, and he's now in custody. And so again, there's just so much that we don't know from the initial start of this incident when the call came out to now with this resolution. And again, we don't know if there was a lag time in when that person was actually cuffed and when this statement came out. But again, all those details will be coming out. It's now incumbent on law enforcement to give the public that update, to let them know that there's no additional threat, and to really set the scene, provide some information on what actually transpired.
Exactly. But of course, they have to make sure there is no additional threat before doing that. And I want to bring in Jonathan Wackrow, CNN law enforcement analyst and former Secret Service agent. What are some of the big questions you have right now? We have learned, as we've been saying, that Aurora Police Department says the suspect has been apprehended. Presumably he was apprehended alive. What are some of the big questions you have now moving forward, Jonathan?
Well, first and foremost, law enforcement is going to ascertain real fast whether or not there's any other danger to the public, whether in the facility or outside the facility. It looks like that this could, potentially be a classic case of workplace violence. Studies have shown from the National Threat Assessment Center that well over 60% of the time, these incidents of workplace violence are as a result of a grievance towards somebody at that facility. So again, what I would want to know right now is the public, is anybody else in danger? And then start getting into the motive. Why did this occur? What happened? What was the evolutionary steps that took to have someone transcend into this violent act?
Right, and I just want to point out some new news that are coming in right now. A city official confirming to CNN that 4 police officers and multiple civilians have been struck. Again, 4 police officers, multiple civilians struck. And we also know that several patients have gone to the local hospitals there in the area near this facility. Are you surprised, given that the suspect is alive? Again, presumably they're saying he was apprehended. Are you surprised?
Well, listen, I don't know all the facts in this case, but what it does show by just the sheer nature that 4 law enforcement officers are now injured just speaks to the dangerous and very dynamic situation that these officers have to face every single time that bell rings that there's a potential active shooter. These guys are rushing into danger, and their primary focus in an active shooter situation is to stop that threat. They are putting themselves between the threat and the public to prevent further harm. Again, statistics have shown that first interaction with law enforcement is going to solve that problem well over 75% of the time by the fact that either that individual is either going to be taken into custody or he's going to be shot by the responding police officers. So unfortunately we have four members of uniformed service are injured, and so right now we have 4 heroes that we need to be looking at.
Okay, I want to bring in Dimitri Roberts now, former Chicago PD and CNN law enforcement analyst. Thank you for coming on. So a witness spoke to affiliate WLS, and again, we have not corroborated this information, but the witness who was in the building when the shooting broke out told our affiliate WLS that the suspected gunman was carrying a pistol equipped with a green laser. The witness went on to say that he knows the man and the shooter is a co-worker of his at that building. As a former investigator, what would you do with that information? What would that tell you, and how would you use it moving forward?
Well, first and foremost, before we go any further, let's acknowledge the fact that we have, as was stated before, we have 4 officers that have been injured that put themselves in between the public and this threat. So
our thoughts and prayers go out to their family and their friends and their loved ones, and we hope that they're all okay. What's going to happen with that first information is really pretty simple. It is we have to verify these facts over time. So there's going to be a lot of information pouring into law enforcement. That information is going to be recorded and then verified over time and help to use to build a case towards both prosecution and finding out if this situation was part of a bigger plan, a bigger plot, or if there's other people involved. The fact that there were devices or other pieces of weaponry used is not surprising, especially given the size of that facility. But again, I think that the more people come out with more information is only going to help law enforcement to sort this out in the long run. And we're glad to have trusted partners that are providing that information to us early on. It's very helpful.
And Dimitri, you used to be with Chicago PD. You know the area. What can you tell us about this area? We were told that a high school is nearby. This is just outside of Chicago. What other light can you shed on the area here that we're looking at in this footage?
Well, as in most Chicago suburbs, they're mostly industrial areas with large facilities like you see there. It looks like this is a logistics type facility. And they, as Josh stated earlier, these are complex situations, very, very difficult for law enforcement to go into and clear in a pretty rapid and succinct way. So, I mean, the fact that there are schools and other type of facilities that are close is not surprising. So, again, I think what law enforcement is thinking about right now is this just a one-off situation? Is this somebody that had a much broader plan? Are there other facilities to include civilian soft targets like schools and other places where there are civilians that may be at risk? And both the FBI and local law enforcement are taking all these things into consideration as we speak.
Okay, and we're just getting some new information in that the 4 police officers that we previously reported were struck in the shooting are stable. So we are told that the 4 police officers are stable. Multiple patients are being treated at local hospitals, Mercy Medical Center, Rush Copley Medical Center. I want to bring back Chief Ramsey because, Chief, you have been on the ground dealing with other shootings in the past. What would you be doing right now? The local police department says that the shooter has been apprehended. What is going on the ground right now?
Well, again, officers are still clearing the building. They're tending to any wounded or evacuating any wounded that may be there. They're trying to gather people who are there, witnesses, because you can't lose your witnesses during a situation like this. So there's a lot going on right now. We don't know the nature and extent of injuries of individuals now. That includes the suspect. Just because he's in custody does not mean that person wasn't wounded. But there's still a lot of information that's going to have to be kind of filtered through so that we can make it that information that we can make public, we make public. So right now, there's an awful lot of activity going on, and it'll be a while before you really start to get a real clear picture on what actually took place. But one thing I would like to say, if this turns out to be a disgruntled employee, he very well may have had specific targets that he was looking for, and not just going through just randomly shooting people. Again, we don't know any of that.
Okay,
these are all things you're going to have to go through.
Thank you, Chief Ramsey. Of course, one of the challenges in fluid situations like this is we don't have a lot of facts we're working with. But Josh Campbell, we are told that 4 police officers, multiple civilians were struck. The 4 officers are stable. The suspect has been apprehended, though police have not said that there is not an ongoing threat. So that is still something we're waiting to hear from police. Now, would you consider this facility where this shooting broke out, the Henry Pratt Company, a valve company, would you consider a place like this a soft target, Josh?
Yeah, so just based on some of the visuals that we've seen, some of the graphics, our research team has been looking at the street maps and a lot of the aerial imagery that we see. It doesn't appear as though that there's robust external perimeter security. Again, we don't know what the actual ingress-egress security mechanisms in place were to actually get in the building. But if this was someone who was supposed to be there, then none of that really matters. If this ends up being a workplace shooting, because if the person had access, then even if there was there were layers of security in place, that person would be able to bypass, but that will be all part of that investigation. We'll also need additional information. We're hearing about the number of officers, but also the number of victims from inside the facility that weren't part of law enforcement in order to, determine the full magnitude and extent of this. I will say that, right now you see this large police presence, all these different agencies. Once the all clear goes out that the person has been apprehended, they all have additional resources that they bring to the table. For example, they're partners with ATF, who we heard from earlier were responding to the scene. They will be critical in the situation to tracking the firearm that was used in order to determine, what the background with that particular device was. You'll have the members of the FBI that are, bringing in their resources, doing checks with law enforcement around the country. Again, law enforcement want to know, is this someone that was known to them? We've seen incidents in the past where a law enforcement, a person known to law enforcement then goes on to commit another act. That's something that they want to rule out, so that's all going on behind the scenes. Just a multifaceted investigation beyond just what we're seeing on our screen right now that's taking place. And then the last part is the subject himself. As we mentioned, he's in custody based on the verbiage that we saw from the authorities. It will be interesting and for us to know whether or not he's actually cooperating, whether he's proud of what he did here and he's talking to law enforcement and telling them that story, or if that's something that they're going to have to find out in other ways. That'll all be part of that investigation.
And again, we don't know if there's an ongoing threat. Police have not said that. But even if the threat is over, and again, we don't know, there is still the aftermath. James Gagliano, again, we're told 4 police officers, multiple civilians struck, but it's unclear if these are just injuries or if there are fatalities. We're waiting to hear more from officials there on the ground. Now, as I mentioned earlier, James, one of the witnesses told affiliate WLS that the suspected gunman was carrying a pistol equipped with a green laser. Now, we should note we have not corroborated this, what this one witness said, and presumably law enforcement want to interview multiple witnesses to get a full account. But what do you make of that? A pistol equipped with a green laser, James?
Well, I mean, not knowing the exact details, I'd assume it was probably an aim point, which is a quick way to pick up a target. And we understand the news we have right now is that it was a handgun. Look, Pam, we're a month and a half into this year, 2019. There have been 16 police officers killed in the line of duty, 7 by assailant gunfire. And we know that 4 officers have been struck. There are multiple civilian casualties as well. And I think one of the things that we've learned going through so many of these in the last couple of years is early reports are often erroneous in these situations. So we need to be patient, find out what the casualty count is, and law enforcement is not going to treat this as a, okay, guys, we're done here. Let's go ahead and celebrate. Let's get everybody to the hospital and we can stand this scene down. They've got to treat this like there might be other co-conspirators who were involved with the person that is in custody right now. Very important for law enforcement not to let their guard down, maintain their perimeters, contain the site, keep the public on the outside of this, and talk to any potential witnesses about things that they might have seen that could lead them to other people or other threats, as in improvised explosive devices or other weapons that may be on the scene.
All right, I want to bring in my colleague Shimon Prokupez for more information here. Again, we're learning that 4 police officers were struck. They're stable. Multiple civilians struck. What more are you learning, Shimon?
Yeah, so it would appear with these officers that have been shot that they intercepted or the shooter, and that would appear how they were injured. It's striking to me, looking on the monitor here, that the ambulance, all these ambulances there, but they're not doing anything, right? We don't see people leaving the scene. We don't see victims being transported. That could be a very good sign, or that could be a very bad sign. Obviously, there have been a lot of people injured here, we're told. We don't have exact numbers yet. I think authorities are still trying to get a handle on exactly how many people have been injured. But, you know, the 4 officers injured, obviously this tells you this was probably quite a gunfight here for the officers. And we'll see. I think what we're hearing from our law enforcement sources is that they're trying to get a handle of what was going on here. We've heard witnesses say that well, at least one person we heard say that he knows the shooter. It's a co-worker. He described the shooting as much as he was able to before he ran out. So that is helpful to law enforcement because they know who they're dealing with. It's not a terrorism attack. It would appear right now to be workplace violence. But nonetheless, I think for right now, I think law enforcement just wants to get a handle on the scene, trying to figure out how many people, how many victims they have here.
And that's always, you know, they're trying to determine whether there's an ongoing threat and also, like you said, deal with the aftermath. How many victims are there? This went on, my understanding is, for about an hour based on our latest information. And again, it's fluid. We've covered, unfortunately, a lot of mass shootings, Shimon. Did that seem like a long time to you?
Yeah, and certainly when you see in these towns these kinds of shootings, it always takes a while for us to sometimes to learn information, and the longer it goes, sometimes the worse it is, and we, you know, because it sometimes indicates that they're still working through the scene, trying to figure out exactly how many victims there are. That tends to happen in these kinds of situations too. The fact that they were calling for more resources, the fact that all these officers ran from the station house to the scene tells you they were probably dealing with a pretty big scene, a big gunfight. This looks like a really big area. So, you know, we don't know. The gunman may have been shooting in several different locations. Doesn't necessarily mean that it was contained to one area of this location. So again, obviously a lot we don't know, but it tells you one thing, certainly when you look at the scene and the officers are standing around and that their ambulances are not moving anyone, that at least for now it appears that the scene would be contained and that police seem to think that they have this under control. So that is one piece of good news. But now we're just waiting to find out exactly how many victims we have here. In any scene like this, when you have this many number of officers shot, it is very telling in terms of what kind of scene this was, what the officers faced when they went in, and you know, I'm sure they were responding to 911 calls. They went in and were probably engaged the shooter almost immediately. It's very rare where you have these kinds of scenes where you have so many police officers shot at one location. So that tells us something right there.
Okay, I want to go to Chief